to be invited by the UW-UX community to speak today, so thank you all. I will start with a little bit about me. Kristen gave a really amazing intro, so I'll debrief it a little bit more. But if you haven't met me, I just graduated from Systems Design Engineering 2020, and I have a background in product design. I've had a few experiences in different types of companies and cultures. Some are better, some are worse. And I'm about to get started full-time at Instagram next Monday. So this talk kind of wraps up my very fun summer vacation at home. Now today I'm going to be talking about product pitching. And for some of the newer and emerging designers out there, product pitching occurs after you have completed all your designs and now you're ready to show it to your client or your interviewer or your senior leadership at work. And I've chosen this topic because I found that it's one of the most important skills that I have personally benefited from throughout my design career. In fact, I consider it my least common denominator in most situations because I can have the most delightful, intuitive, and well-crafted designs, but if I'm unable to pitch my work eloquently, my designs don't get pushed or I don't get the job. A little bit of a disclaimer, even though this talk isn't at all related to Instagram, I will be focusing on my experiences there, since this skill, the ability to defend your designs, was more important there than any other company. And the skill has also helped out my team significantly in our 4th year design project, which led us to win an award. Yay. Yeah. And so my talk is going to be around 35 to 40 minutes long. And like Kristen said, there's going to be a Q&A at the end. So I will try to answer your questions then. Now, make sure you grab your water or your wine or honestly, whatever you prefer, and we can get started. When I was at Instagram, I knew from the very beginning that my last deliverable and my ultimate test was this thing that they called a design review. Now, don't get this confused with a design crit. A design review is when they put you in a room with some of the most highly influential designers at Instagram, and then you're asked to pitch. Now, I had this rare opportunity of being able to do this as an intern, and I wasn't going to waste it. During the pitch, you get the equivalent of a green light to move forward with your project, or you don't. And I was told that there was going to be 12 whole people there, so I was kind of terrified. Hence, when my manager asked me what I wanted to focus on during my internship, it wasn't really project specific at all. I wanted to be able to concisely articulate my designs, to learn how to provide just the right amount of context, and to be equipped to respond to any questions or feedback afterwards. And luckily, or we can say deliberately, it was a skill that I definitely honed in on throughout my internship and managed to receive some pretty positive feedback following my design review. Their comments were, Ashley structured her pitch so soundly such that almost no argument can be made against her. And that's why this talk is called Lowering Up Your Design Pitch. Because after all the blood, the sweat, the tears that you invest into your designs, you really do want your work to shine like the dime that it is. And you can't really rely on the concept of good work speaks for itself, because it didn't, especially not in my case. And in other words, from today on, you want to think of your design pitch like a legal case. You want to learn to build it up such that you have an indisputable argument against any attack that comes your way. So in other words, we are going to pull out our inner Mike Ross. My talk is going to be structured like this. It's going to be broken down into 2 sections. We have flow and we have delivery, as they do require different sets of skills. And at the end, we're going to loop it back to see how everything fits together. So let's get started with the very first section, which is flow. I don't want to prescribe a specific flow per se, as I do generally follow the order I see fit, depending on the audience and the context. But the following slides should at least provide a skeleton for you to start and modify accordingly. In the design pitch or a case study, the first thing I like to do is to bring to the audience's attention the problem. Why are they here today? Why is it important that they are listening to me? I won't be spending too much time or any time at all on teaching you guys how to write a concise and effective problem statement. That's another beast of itself. And also there's quite a few Medium articles out there on this. Instead, I'll be focusing on how to frame your problem with the right amount of context for your pitch. Okay, so here on the screen, we can see a slide, and we can just imagine a black slide. Not sure I picked the color, but I love black, so it's good. And on this slide, which I am titling Problem, I will generally have a couple of lines to give a high-level overview of the problem that I'm tackling. I do spend a significant amount of time writing and iterating on these few lines because it sets the stage for the rest of the pitch. It is also at this point where you try to hit the golden ratio of providing just the right amount of context. And I don't mean 1.618. This is a fluid ratio that I'm talking about. And it really depends on how much context the audience already has. Then I might also include a visual aid, either the current state of the system or a picture, depending on how it manifests itself in the real world. Now, going back to the problem statement, I should mention that I don't typically have a separate and independent slide just to provide context, since that would require my listeners to use their brains to make a connection with the problem that I was proposing. And obviously, I want to keep my presentation as low effort as possible for those who have graciously given me their time. And so the best that we can do is to try to seamlessly integrate the problem statement and context into one paragraph. I understand sometimes that it is very hard to nail that sweet spot. And that's exactly what happened when I was at Instagram. I was tasked to create a new design system for the footer on Instagram stories. And the problem statement that I had drafted up was, the stories footer isn't flexible enough to accommodate the growing needs of people and businesses. It's become inconsistent and unwieldy as teams introduce complexity. I struggled to include more context here, mainly because I was trying to introduce two separate issues. So there was a lot of things going on. Number one, the current system wasn't flexible enough. And number two, it's become inconsistent across the platform. So unable to add more context to this already cluttered slide, there were two different routes that I could take to support it. Path one, we have here, we split them up into two individual high-level problems. Path two, we keep it as one single high-level problem and discuss them from two separate and more specific angles. Now, I'm hoping you guys can take a good look at these two options, because in a second, I'll just want to get a sense for what you guys think is the best approach to take. As a reminder, here was my problem statement. And yeah, I'll just give you guys 30 seconds to read that. And then Kristen will set up a poll for us. Thank you. Also, heads up, there is no right or wrong. I will share the route that I picked later that I felt was best suited for me, but there's pros and cons to both. And thank you again, Kristen, for setting this up.
No worries. Give it like 10 more seconds or so. Cool.
All right. Okay. Ooh. Forgot we shared the results, right?
Yep, that's the results.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay, I see that you guys picked, 67% of you guys picked path two. And okay, I don't know how to navigate. Wait 1 second. I need to close this. Sorry. Oh, now I can't see myself anymore. Okay, so 67% of you guys picked path two. And what I personally decided on was also to go with path two. Okay, that didn't work. Okay. For my project, I like the latter option because it was easier to talk about design explorations later on and to measure success based on one central problem. By contrast, measuring success for option one would look like this. Was the first problem successful? Was the second problem successful? Whereas for pass 2, even though I do use up more slide space, I found it simpler to be able to link it back to the original single high-level issue. Now, there is a bit of a disclaimer here. Given these two options, what you don't want to do is to use the second option to pitch ideas of different levels of importance and depth. Say you are presenting one angle as a system design issue, and another one as a visual or maybe even an interaction design issue. All three fall under the umbrella of product design, and that gets confusing. In this situation, depending on the impact of each of the two angles that you're presenting, one might overshadow another when it comes to making decisions about the original high-level problem. It might also create an environment for a very wide scope of conversation, and that's not what you want. Because the narrower the scope, the more likely you'll be able to prepare for the types of questions that you might be asked. Thus, if you pick path 2, what we want to do is to try to keep the angles to be of similar importance and depth, which is the case for my Instagram case study. In other words, in the situation that I mentioned earlier, where I'm proposing a higher level system design issue and a separate, more detailed visual design issue, I would actually go with option 1, since these individual problems have different importance and depth. I just would want to make sure to state it upfront to a recruiter or whoever it is that I am presenting it to. Sometimes with 2 separate problems, I might even consider splitting it up into 2 presentations altogether or 2 separate case studies. And the purpose is I want to keep the discussions focused and effective. It'll be easier to have in-depth conversations about each individual issue that way. Think about it like a lawyer in court. You want to keep the discussion targeted so that you're mentally prepared to defend the area that you're fighting for. When you widen that area, it becomes more difficult for you to defend because there's more things to consider. You can see how it's all a bit strategic at the end of the day. So to sum this part up, my preference would be to pick this one first, if I'm able to do it. So to keep it as one single high-level problem without additional angles to keep it simple. But that isn't always possible. And if it is more detailed than that, then I break it up into different angles with, as long as they're along the same plane of importance and depth. And otherwise, my last resort is to break it up into separate problems or decks entirely, depending on if I'm presenting to a team at work or a recruiter. Since during interviews, I still prefer to keep everything in one deck. I know I spent a lot of time on this section, but it's pretty important to get right because it sets the meeting or interview off on the right foot. The goal. This section is pretty intuitive because really your underlying goal should have been evident in the problem statement, which is why sometimes I don't even include it at all. If I were to talk about it, however, the way that I like to do it is to bring to light the company's goal and show how they align with my own personal goals. And that may look something like this. We have our business or systems goal here, and I might have my project goal here, both of which directly link back to the problem statement I mentioned earlier. For my project, a higher level business goal might be to give users more transparency and trust when they take an action. A personal goal of mine is more specific and actionable. Maybe it would be to audit the current footer system in order to develop a unified framework for the footer. Then I'll add a sentence or 2 about how these goals really are the same goal, showing that I have aligned with the company's needs. It's also this that I use to measure success at the end. Occasionally, I will find myself in a situation where the business and the project goals are basically interchangeable, which in that case, I'll just have a slide with a single goal. There have also been rare cases where I truly feel that I've been transparent enough about my goal that there really isn't a need to state it. Usually this happens when I'm presenting to people on my team who have sufficient context on what is driving my decision making. Then I'll drop the slide altogether. Always make sure to be asking yourself, does this flow feel natural, and does the slide add value? because time and time again, I find myself questioning whether I've included something because it truly helps the audience, or whether it's because I feel the need to do so because of a prescribed framework, which I've done so many times as well. And the latter is a no-no. Explorations. The section is a bit meaty, but it's very important that we get this right, because this is where the majority of the questions following your pitch are going to be targeted at. For my design review at Instagram, I tried out a few different ways to exhibit my explorations. At first, my approach was to show my proposed design and then show all these other options and discuss their pros and cons to indicate that, oh, I've considered all these options. But I am giving that a thumbs down because I got the order all wrong. My order suggested that, hey, look, I did consider all these other options, but I've already made a final decision without you. An effective design pitch or case study should feel inviting to the listener, and a good one should encourage questions. It's just that it would encourage the right questions. You want to be able to narrow down on the types of questions that they could ask you. Although I'm sure you've already thought of all the reasons why your design is truly the best approach, because after all, our designs are our firstborn, but you'll still want the audience to feel like they contributed to the decision making during that meeting. It's the subtle art of negotiation. So to revise, I swapped the order. In this version, I started with, I explored all these options. These were the pros, these were the cons, and then I show what I proposed. But after practicing this a few times through as well, it didn't really cut it. I was placing equal emphasis on each design iteration, indicating that each pro and each con were equally weighted in my decision-making process. In reality, that is not true. I didn't, in fact, spend equal amounts of time on each exploration. I put more thought in the higher fidelity ones and the more viable ones, and I wanted to focus on my discussions there. So that's a thumbs down too. My third approach was to focus my energy proportionally based on the amount of brain power that I put into that exploration. Because the more time you spend talking about something, the more likely the audience's attention is also focused on it. In other words, that's probably what they're going to be asking you about later. But I still ran into a problem there. In each design project, there are typically product, interaction, and visual design components to it. Their importance may not be equally weighted, but they're all still there. What I struggled with during this version was that I like to narrow down on my designs from all three aspects. In my mind, I thought that my decision-making funnel looked like this. I made the product decisions first, then I worked on the flow, and then I honed in on the visual details. And then, bam, the final product was born. But by doing so, I framed my design explorations in a way that downplayed the importance of later decisions, when I was truly being intentional about all three aspects: product, flow, and visual. So I kind of incorrectly inferred how humans think altogether. According to psychology, a typical person's thought process is linear, unless of course you're Bill Gates. And it just happens that our brains aren't very great at parallel processing. By incorporating all three types of decisions into one decision-making funnel, I haven't really shown how I was able to narrow down on each of them, paving a path to my own demise after this pitch is done. Because I'll have missed many little but very important decisions that were supposed to strengthen my defense in all these three areas. So don't do that as well. Instead, we should follow a more linear path for discussing our decisions. Pick one of these three funnels as a focus for your decision-making process, keeping in mind which is the most impactful to the problem that you're trying to solve. Then you'll want to talk about it and store the rest in your archive, which I'll mention more later. And you can talk about a few little things here and there, but your focus should be very, very clear. And the things that you left out, it's okay, because you'll be prepared to talk about that and bring up your archive and address it when the time is right. So this led me to my fourth and final version of explorations. And it sounded something like this. Here are some of my explorations. Some of them added more visual clutter. Others may have introduced more complexity to the feature when our goal was really to reduce the complexity. For example, This one over here had this problem. This one worked, but it was more flexible for both use cases. I understand that. But the issue is it was likely to interfere with existing navigation. So that's a con. This one was great in this area, but it doesn't truly fully address the problem that we were talking about. And finally, these ones were our runner-up ideas. The one on the left was appealing because of all these reasons, and I will want to spend some time talking about that and increase the amount of time I spend talking about that. Then I go on to the last exploration on the screen. This one was also appealing because of reason 1, 2, 3, and then I'll spend most of my time talking about that exploration. And I'll sum it up and say, in the end, we decided on this design because of blah, all these reasons. And then I'll loop it back to the original problem again. As you can see, I ordered the explorations such that the first few I talked about had more cons than pros. As the explorations became more viable, I increased the amount of time I spent explaining my design rationale, represented by these double arrow delta T's because I am a nerd. All right, so to summarize this meaty section, number 1, the order matters. Go from wide to narrow, but keep on the same level of depth when you're explaining design decisions, whether that's product, interaction, or visual. Number 2, keep the timing in check as well. Frame explorations from the least viable option to the most viable option. Spend less time talking about your earlier explorations and really try to center your discussion on the truly difficult decisions. You want to think about it like an inverting funnel. You want to narrow down your decision, the funnel gets smaller, and at the same time, invert the funnel and increase the amount of time you spend talking about it. And one last tip here, when showing explorations, either zoom in to the area that you've changed or have an arrow pointing at it. Because I heard that recruiters don't like it when there's this giant mock-up and they don't really know what to look at. So, for example, wouldn't you agree if I removed these arrows, it would make it more confusing? Because I feel like now I don't really know what I'm looking at. Onto the prototype. Not everyone has one, but if you do, there are 2 main questions that you need to answer. How are you going to show it? And when are you going to show it? To answer the how, I typically like to screen record the relevant or flow or interaction beforehand. Key emphasis on the word relevant because in the past, I've had the habit of trying to show every single cool feature or flow I've designed, regardless of the importance, and that really isn't effective. Instead, what I like to do now, is to screen record the main flow or feature that I am currently presenting. I don't record my voice when I do it, but I do speak out loud as I'm recording it so that I can get the timing right. I also make sure to draw these little circles on the screen here in order to refer to the area that I'm talking about. Really, the big question is what you're trying to show and which interactions are important. This is not to say a micro interaction is going to be less important than showing a larger flow. It really depends on the problem statement that you mentioned earlier. If it's a novel micro interaction that you've created, you should definitely show it. But don't show something for the sake of showing it. It must add value to your presentation. I sound like a broken record, but I need to quadruple check with myself usually as well. The question of when to show your prototype is pretty easy to answer. I typically show it after my exploration section. Or if you think that the listeners might struggle to understand the context of the problem that you're trying to solve and would benefit from a visual aid, I would show it briefly right before your goals and after the problem. And later, again, go into more detail after the exploration section where it is right now. You also don't have to record anything. It's totally okay to just pull up your prototype on the spot. It's honestly whatever works best for you and what you have the time to do. I know for myself that I somehow lose all my technical capabilities on the spot. And so I like to be guided by a flow that I know 1000% won't be changed. This is what works for me. So we made it to the conclusion section of the flow, not my presentation. And for the conclusion, I'll usually say a line or two about what we talked about today and again, loop it back to the original problem. You can see a trend here, looping it back to the original problem. And here's how it might sound. This was the goal. This was the gap. And this is how we close the gap. And then immediately afterwards, I'll talk about my next steps. For a design pitch, that might be who I'll talk to, limitations of my design, which is actually a good thing to bring up because it shows that you're still open to feedback, even though you already know that you've got something amazing going on over there. As well, any plans to gather more data if possible. For a case study, make sure to also include anything specific about any product interaction that you need to make but weren't able to due to time constraints, which in my opinion is a completely valid limitation on your end. And one last thing before I close, I often like to specify the types of feedback that I'm looking for in order to create a smoother transition into it leaves the seed of thought for them to think about when coming up with questions to ask me. Because after all, they're there to ask me questions. For example, I might request input on use cases I haven't considered before, or areas I should explore more, or recommended teams that I should align with. It helps both you and them to be transparent about the types of feedback that you're looking for. Finally, like I said, I always include my famous archive section. And this is where I store the remainder of my poker hands, just waiting for the right moment to show. And these hands may include other explorations. This is something I always include because I usually only show the key explorations in my pitch. An example might be if my problem was mainly a system design issue, I will also include visual or interaction design explorations here and vice versa. For example, I may have screens that show an outline camera versus one that has a darker background, an interaction that involves iOS's tap and hold versus a hidden swipe. And even though these design decisions weren't the most important part of my pitch, I'll still be ready to show and tell when I'm asked. I might also include market or competitive research, user research, information architecture considerations, high-level flow diagrams, and also lower fidelity process work. Because if this were an interview, I would also encourage you to show a few in the main portion of your presentation prior to the exploration section. But don't spend too much time talking about the process itself, because I find that interviewers care much more about the design decisions that you make rather than the process itself. And this is a bonus. If you have any data, please try to include it. It's a huge bonus. By having an archive section, I'll have all my ducks in order when the time is ready. In court, lawyers don't usually present all their proofs and witnesses up front. They wait until it's the right moment so that the rationale is timely and relevant. In design, this is usually when you're asked questions following your presentation. When you feel challenged and your word isn't sufficient to prove that your point is right, then you can navigate to the prepared slide deck for leverage. This not only shows preparation from your end, but you'll also feel excited when you're talking about it because you've literally been waiting for them to ask these questions. I remember my 4th year design project. My team, we had a thick archive. And for our final panel exams, we were literally nudging our professors to ask certain questions so that we can share what we prepared in our archives. And it worked. To summarize this section, we talked about how you can be strategic about your flow. Maybe you've already found a flow that you're comfortable with, or maybe you're still in search for something that works for you. If that's the case, then this might provide a starting point. Then once you found your flow, try to be mindful about where you want to focus your energy, because it's likely that the questions asked will directly reflect that. All right, I've shown you guys a lot of information already, and I'm going to wrap up my talk soon with some advice on delivery. I am what I call a performing extrovert, meaning that I'm able to call upon my extroverted side on demand, even though I'll likely need a bit of a recharge afterwards. And this also means that it takes extra time for me to prepare so that I feel ready when I speak. What's helped me a lot in the process of improving my delivery really comes down to 2 things. How prepared I am before I speak, and how relaxed I am while I speak. The first part of the magic formula is preparation. We already discussed different ways we can tackle the flow so that it's more digestible for your listeners. Another way I prepare is to present to a lower risk test audience first to gather their feedback before presenting to the actual stakeholders. So for example, for this talk, I did have the luxury of test running it with the UWX team first. At Instagram, I presented to my peers, my own project team, which included engineering and product people, as well as some designers on Instagram Home. And this is before I delivered my final pitch during design review. I also try to focus on making very small and incremental changes to my deck after each test run, making sure to filter through the feedback and implementing the ones that made sense to me. And I like to think this method worked because the first time I gave my pitch to a small group of designers at Instagram, I sucked so bad. And then I somehow managed to lawyer up based on the quote I shared at the very beginning. So for my shy and independent friends who are listening right now, I'm going to spell this out for you. That means you're going to need to ask for some help. And I didn't get to where I am today on my own, and I'm very grateful that I've accepted a bunch of feedback along the way. Beyond just gathering loads of feedback though, it's also a given that, that we should practice a little bit. Sometimes I won't just practice. I might even record myself if I'm really feeling a lack of confidence. So if I'm uber nervous, although it might feel unbearable to listen to yourself at first, this method works because when your attention is focused 100% on listening to yourself rather than 20% listening and 80% trying not to screw up your next word, it'll become very obvious to you what doesn't flow or what doesn't sound powerful enough, and you'll be able to change it. And let me tell you, this advice has been given to me by many excellent speakers whom I admire. And from my own personal experience, I don't think they're lying. Now you just got to get over the weirdness of recording yourself and try it. Okay, on to the last magical ingredient, relaxation. Here's a final story for you. As you can tell, I was pretty nervous about that design review. In fact, I was so nervous that day of my presentation, I was having trouble speaking coherently at all. However, if I was going to do well, I wasn't about to trip over every other sentence. So what I did was I booked out a meeting room beforehand, one of the ones with the screened out windows, and I kind of danced around for a little bit. And thanks to the Lord no one walked in that day, because that totally calmed me down. And the point of me telling you that story is that everybody gets nervous. And it's important that you know what coping mechanisms work for you. Even if it involves doing a little dance around a meeting room, that's okay too. So I'm leaving you with this. You can't prevent the attack, but you can lawyer up for it. By working on your flow, by practicing your delivery, and putting yourself in the best possible mind space before you speak. Also, we can leave feeling like, okay, where is it? Miss Rachel Zane over here, whom I consider a true lawyer, and in our case, we would be a true designer. These tactics work for me, and hopefully you guys will find something here that will help you guys figure out what works for you. And I do leave you with a disclaimer. There have been numerous times where I still have been challenged with a question I haven't thought of yet, and that is even after all the work I put into my design pitches. But that's actually a good thing because the questions will come. The quote says, you can't prevent the attack. The difference is now that you wouldn't have wasted your time defending questions that should be obvious, and instead you focus their attention on the truly difficult and controversial questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Oh my goodness, learned so much. Product pitching is super important.
It's super scary.
Agreed, honestly. Awesome. Well, I guess we can move on to the Q&A. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or the Q&A section.
I will stop screen sharing. Let me see if this works. I'm back, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
See everyone's beautiful faces.
Yay, I can see people again.
Awesome. Okay. I guess I'll just kick it off right off the bat as people maybe type some questions. So I know you've like basically talked about like everything about how to basically pitch and structure it. How did all of that sort of apply to the presentation you have done for us today?
Oh my gosh, that is an amazing question. So in my talk, we talked about flow and delivery. And obviously the flow doesn't directly apply here, but if you think about it, I did come up with a problem and a goal. So my goal, my problem, well, my problem was kind of the same thing as my goal, and it was to teach you guys how to do a good design pitch. And so from that, I then moved on to exploration. And so what I started off with is I have my little notebook here, which I love. And if you guys ever want an Amazon link for it, message me because I love it so much. And I brain dumped all my ideas onto here. So I would consider that the lowest fidelity exploration because my thoughts are very messy. I'm very sporadic when I think. And so I just dumped it all on here. And then what I went and did was I just crossed out what didn't work. So that's me going through and revising. Now, moving from low fidelity to high fidelity, I moved it into Google Docs. And there, I structured my pitch so that I knew what I was going to say a little bit more and that it was framed in a more human understandable language, not just what makes sense in my head. And then I moved over to putting this together in a deck, which I would consider my prototype. And I should share this with you because I think it's helpful to see the way that I prepare for my pitches. And if I show you what happens behind the screen, this might help a little bit because I do something similar for my pitches. But here, let me go to this desktop. Okay, so I'm hoping that you guys can see this. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So what I do is I have speaker notes. So if I don't have time, then I won't have speaker notes. But in addition to that, I also make sure that I indicate where to click because I love Keynote. It gives me so many animations and I think that's cool. But then if I screw up the animations, then everything gets a little messy. And so I don't want to do that. I usually revise it a few times and then I'll just talk it through once myself and then maybe present it to other people, for example, the UWX community or the team first, and then I'll revise accordingly. And now the other thing is I actually love this about Keynote, but you can skip a slide. It's the best feature ever. So if I'm talking through, I don't want to delete a slide and create a bajillion iterations, which I tend to do anyway. So what I'll do is I'll skip over the slide and I'll speak through it as if I'm skipping through the slide because when I present it, it will skip through it. At least I hope so. Yeah, it does skip through it. And so by doing that, I can work through the flow that way and to figure out what really flows the best. And then maybe for this talk, okay, well, for this talk, I wasn't so nervous that I needed to, dance around a meeting room or anything like that. But I was a little bit nervous, so I just started vacuuming, and that helped, and that was good. So yeah, that's how I applied it to this talk.
Awesome. We have another question here. What is the main difference between a presentation in an interview versus at work?
Okay, so in an interview, I think that there are two different things that I want to talk about here. So number one, during an interview, you do want to show that you've considered all three options. So this is talking about, I guess, design pitches and a case study during an interview. And I did mention a couple of advice on how to adjust things here and there. But the main thing is when you're doing an interview, you do want to show lower fidelity work. And that's important because they want to know that you've gone through the process of thinking from low to high fidelity. But again, don't spend too much time talking about that. Just be sure to have it there and talk about it a little bit. And if they ask about it, you'll have it ready. But at work, people don't spend a lot of time looking at your lower fidelity work. They want to really focus the discussion on what you've thought through, what you've aligned with other teams on, and chances are that is more higher fidelity work. And so in that sense, I do see a difference in how I would structure it. And in addition, when I interview, I also try to include bits more of product interaction and visual. I know I talked about that funnel, but I still try to loop it in a little more than I normally would at work, because the purpose of a pitch is to defend your work. But in an interview, you still want to defend the main portion of your work, and you still want to keep the scope kind of narrow, but you just want to add in just the right amount of the other two areas that you haven't focused on as much to show that you have actually considered it. And let me see if I had another piece of advice. Oh yes, I feel like at work, when you're talking about next steps, you should focus a lot of time talking about it, which I still think that for an interview, you should talk a lot about your next steps. But I would say that the interviewer would ask you questions on that instead of you just delivering a bunch of information up front, because chances are they have questions about specific parts of your design for next steps, versus when you're presenting it as the pitch, you kind of want to show that you have the initiative of taking this project forward, which isn't really the case when it comes to an interview. But yeah, those are my 3 tips.
Great. Okay, next question. Amazing presentation. Does this apply to interviews with recruiters on existing projects or design challenges? I'm feeling a bit nervous for some upcoming ones.
Okay, don't feel nervous. Everyone feels nervous, but we gotta tell ourselves not to feel nervous. Okay, so the question is if it applies to like existing case studies. And sorry, would you be able to actually repeat it again?
Yep. Does this apply to interviews with recruiters on existing projects or design challenges?
Okay, so I'm thinking the question means whether this talk or the order of the pitch applies. And I would say that it does apply, except that we should add the other aspects in as well. I would say that when presenting a project, it depends on if you're presenting also a design challenge or a side project or a project you did at work, because the scope will be kind of different. And if you are presenting, say, a side project or a design challenge, time is of the essence, but you wouldn't want to do that as much. You wouldn't want to show as much. Time is of the essence because it's more of a longer term thing when it's at work. So specifically answering your questions focused on interviews, I would say that everything does apply as it is. Add in those 3 things that I talked about earlier. And in addition to that, just be ready to defend more of the other areas. So everything pretty much stays the same, but just make sure that you have also very strong backups for the other 2 areas that you haven't talked about as much. So say if you focus on product, which chances are for most design interviews, you'll want to focus on product because it's the most highest level thinking. And then you want to think about what the recruiter is focused on. So for example, depending on the interview that I was doing, some recruiters tended to focus more on specific visual positions. So when I was interviewing for Instagram, they really focused on the visual part of a certain thing. And so when you notice that a recruiter is thinking about that, then you want to spend more time talking about it. And for a different interview, they focus more on product. And so it really depends. But at work, the difference is you want to focus your conversation on what you went to talk about. So if you're going off track, then you'll want to kind of steer them back on track because you came to defend what you were trying to show.
Great. Next one, how do you know what is considered the most interesting information to include in the actual presentation versus in the archive?
Right. So it definitely did take a bit of practice. I would say that, so a couple of things I did in the very beginning of my design career was I got a lot of feedback. And I got less feedback from, I would say, my peers, because I feel like when your peers are looking at it, it's from a similar eye. And what I try to do is I try to show it to different types of people. So even if you're interviewing right now and you have a mentor at work, or you have someone at work that you could show this to, or someone who you really look up to and you want to get their advice, and they're not in design, I think that would be totally okay. Because what I did in the very beginning is not only did I show to mentors who I admire in the design field, but I also showed product people and engineering people, because specific to interviews, I would say, is when you're interviewing, like there's going to be different groups of people who are looking at you as a candidate, and you have to be able to understand it from all the different angles. And then after that, and this applies to both pitches at work and case studies, when you're interviewing, you just want to practice the flow a few times and just share it with people, and then you want to talk it through yourself. And I personally think it's best if you record it to see how it sounds and then adjust accordingly. But in addition to that, I would just say it's really hard. It's really hard to define what's interesting without a lot of experience. So in the beginning, it's really important that you ask for different people's perspectives, because you don't know what you don't know. But once you get to, once you have a little bit more experience, then if you look at it and you speak it over a few times, then you'll be able to pick it up. And that's definitely somewhere you can get. I think just in the early stages, don't be afraid to ask for help from different groups of people. And for example, when I was at Airware back in 2017, my boss knew that I was interviewing elsewhere. And I don't think that's something you should be ashamed of, because we're doing internships. And I asked him to get his advice on something. And then he directed me to like the recruiter or like the product person. They were like, oh, you should ask them to look at it, because they have a different eye. And when they look at it, it's going to flow better if they see, say, this stat up there versus the final mock-up. So those gave me a lot of insight. And I think that different people will also give you different insights.
That's a really good idea. I didn't think about that part before myself. Oh my goodness.
Asking for help is hard though. Yeah.
Agreed. All right, we have about 3 minutes left, so let's try and get maybe 1 or 2 more in. I'm sorry, I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of them, but here's one. Has anyone ever turned down a design pitch? And if so, how did you deal with it?
I'm thinking when we're talking about turning down a design pitch, we're talking about you don't have the green light to move forward with a project. So I'm going to answer it as if it were that. And if it's not the case, then leave it in the chat and I will adjust what I'm answering. But so I haven't personally experienced not getting the green light to move forward. Usually what will happen is you will have parts of your project where they're like, okay, this project is moving forward, but these aspects need to be worked on more. And luckily, I haven't had that experience, but I would say to avoid that experience to the best of your abilities, something that you can do is to try to loop in the people progressively as you go up. So for example, at work, if I were to present during a design pitch, I've kind of planted these seeds of thought around already. So I have people backing me up. And so, for example, if it's a project that involves engineering, like I've already gotten the engineers on board. And when I say on board, it's not like I'm presenting this pitch to them and being like, hey, what do you guys feel about it? I'm really like trying to work with them from the very beginning to see like how we can create this product together. Because once someone feels like they've contributed, then they're less likely to turn something down altogether because you created this thing together. And it's also why during a pitch, you want to strategically organize it so that they feel like they've also made that decision with you. And then since I have people on board and them giving me their opinions, usually this helps me a lot when I'm giving a design pitch, because they know that it's not like, oh, I'm just barging in there with like this new design and no one's on board. It's like, I thought this through and I've talked to all the right teams. And so I think that is something that really helps a lot when you're at work. I don't know how that would apply to, I don't think that would apply as much to interviews, but yeah.
Sweet. Okay, this one's a little similar to one earlier. Someone asked about applying this to like existing products and design challenges. But this one asks if you would use a similar approach for talking about projects on a website portfolio. So
the way that I think about website portfolios, it's very similar in the sense where you want to structure it such that it's a defensible argument. And I actually, in the past, what I did was, instead of creating a case study or like a deck for different interviews, I would just pull out my portfolio and just walk through my case study. So for me, that was 2 birds in 1 stone. Something that I did change a little bit for my website would be that I think I would also include other sections, because this is when I'm walking through my website during an interview, I don't have to go through all the sections. But the thing about a website as well is I try not to show everything, because I do want to leave a little bit of room for what I'm going to explain more on the spot. It should just be a hook to get the interview, and then afterwards you'll be able to discuss it more. So I do think it applies more, like it does apply to a website, but you should feel welcome to include more information on there, because you can strategically navigate it when you're talking through an interview, if you choose to use it that way. Otherwise, the people who are looking at it, the recruiters, they can go through it at their own pace. But again, I would just try to keep the structure in mind and maybe modify it a little bit, because recruiters don't have that much time and they scan. And so depending on who's looking, sometimes they will pass it off to a product person, or sometimes they'll just look at a few lines. Just make sure you keep, instead of keeping it such a linear flow, make sure all the right important things are up at the top. And another thing for a website, if you're using it as a case study, always make sure to include a table of contents so that they can go through it at their own pace, because a presentation like this one is more linear and I'm directing the flow of the conversation.
Perfect. Okay. We are a little bit over time, actually. So maybe one last question, or if that's okay.
Yeah. I can do one more question.
Okay. Someone has asked, how do you know out of product, flow, and visual, which is the most important funnel to talk about?
Okay, so to reiterate, the question is asking which of the funnels is the most important to talk about.
Yeah.
I really think that depends on your project and the problem statement that you're trying to solve. So if it's a higher level, when you're working as a product designer, even when you're working as a product designer, I found that I have many different kinds of projects. Some of them, they're very unfleshed out and it's very exploratory. I barely get to the prototyping stage. And then other times I've worked through this product thing already, and I presented it to a design pitch, but then afterwards, I'm not getting the green light on the entire thing. The product is fine, but then these little things are not fine. And so then I would need to hone in on the problem that they're talking about. So it really depends on the problem statement that you have talked about in the very beginning. So if it's a visual design issue that you presented, then focus on visual. If it's an interaction thing, then focus on interaction. During an interview, you'll probably want to focus on product, but at work, I find that even as a product designer, all three come up. And I would just say that, just focus on the one depending on what is most important to you. And I think that we often downplay the little details. So for example, this is I am a product designer, you really need to be focusing on these little tiny details, but it is the tiny details that make the last 10% of a difference, even though 90% is covered by product and interaction. And so by showing that you have thought through all the little things, it really just plugs the hole in your argument, because one tiny thing can end up exploding into a big thing, and then it can lead to a project not moving forward, and you would never want that. So make sure you've thought through all of it, but start obviously with the bigger questions, and then as you move forward with the project, you're getting the green light on the bigger things, then have a different deck for the smaller things and talk about that problem on a lower level, and then talk about the lower level problems until this project is like gone the 1,000% green light and you can move forward. Every aspect of it is great. And then you ship it.
Perfect. All right. So this concludes tonight's talk, if that's okay for everyone. Ran a little bit over time, but I'm super happy we were able to get that question in. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Special thanks to Ashley for taking the time to share everything with us. I hope everyone learned a ton because honestly, so much. It was incredible. If everyone can, yeah, no, we're so happy to have you. If everyone can actually fill out, there is a feedback form that will be sent out once you close the webinar. We'll also be sending it in our Slack. If you can fill that out, that would be awesome, just so we know how we can improve future talks for you. And also don't forget to join our Slack if you haven't done that yet. It was sent earlier in the chat, and it will also be on that feedback form that I hope you get the link to. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night then. Thanks, Ashley.
Bye. Thank you.